So we'll be looking at the public debt dynamics. And before I go into public debt, I think it is important to think about debt from an individualistic perspective. If you have debt, it means that you're simply living beyond your means. Now, debt is not necessarily bad. If you actually look at the most economists will tell you that the poor are not bankable, so they can't borrow. The richest are actually the ones who are attractive. So meaning that you can actually use debt to leverage economic prosperity, whether it's from an individualistic perspective. We do have three key main economic agents. Usually you have households, that's just us. Then you have the corporate or the firm, and then you have the public on the other side. So what we're looking at is public. When we say public, we're referring to government. So it could be central government, local government, and other state corporations. Now you notice that for our case, we'll be focusing more on public debt. Now, how does public debt arise? Public debt arises because government spend beyond the revenue that they are collecting. Now, there are usually two forms of revenue which is usually the tax revenue that you pay, either in terms of direct revenue or indirect revenue. Direct revenue could be what you're paying if you consume water, what you're paying on goods and services. That's indirect revenue. Then you can also have non-tax revenue. If you're paying for a passport, if you're paying for, but all that collectively would give you a pool of what we call domestic revenue. Now that pool of domestic revenue is then what would backstop the expenditure. So every year, I believe your ministers of finance come and tell you that we're going to spend this much, but our revenue expected is this much. So when the revenue is not enough to meet your expenditure plans, then you run what we call a budget deficit. Now when you run a budget deficit, or what we call a fiscal deficit, it means that you have to finance it somehow. Some countries would go down and print money to finance that fiscal deficit, but that is not recommended, because then you're pumping a lot of money, which would cause prices to rise. So then you can come back and borrow. Now, two forms of borrowing could be: you either come back and borrow from the domestic market. I know here in Kenya they do significant borrowing from the domestic market. So borrowing from the domestic market is an IOU. So government just gives you a paper and you give them money. But the tenor could vary from, the short term and long term. So that's domestic borrowing. But in most instances, domestic borrowing is expensive, because you're borrowing, it's very expensive. If I take an example of where I come from, if government is borrowing from the market, it's paying 10%. So that's quite expensive, at least 10%. So if it's longer term debt, then it's paying higher. Then if you can't meet all your domestic borrowing can't meet your fiscal deficit, then you will turn. So you could also get, by the way, I forgot, that you could get grants from the bilateral donors. But that also may not meet you. So then it would mean that you'd have to borrow from the foreign, you'd have to borrow from the external sources. So now that foreign borrowing also comes in two ways. Traditionally, we used to borrow from the bilateral development institutions. Now, what these ones were giving us, what we call concessional borrowing. Now, that form of concessional borrowing was long-term in nature, 50 years. It had a longer-term grace period, and the interest rates were near zero. So they were friendly terms of borrowing. But they also had significant conditionality. So the negotiation for these loans would take time. Now, in recent years, we've seen an emergence of non-concessional borrowing. So it's shorter term tenor, shorter grace period, and near market rate interest rate. So meaning that this is costly. Now the challenge is with concessional, because when we are looking at debt, debt becomes unbearable if you cannot meet your short-term needs. You start to struggle with what we call liquidity challenge. Then the debt becomes a burden when you become insolvent. So at that point when you become insolvent, you actually are not failing to meet your, but you also fail, you are basically bankrupt. So now the risk, those are the two risks that when you're managing debt, even from an individualistic point of view, you're looking at, are you having any liquidity challenge? Or are you likely to have, debt burden? Eventually you can't meet, you basically won't meet any of your needs. So those are the things that I think we should be looking at. So any budget deficit that you accrue contributes to your public debt. We have been borrowing for many years, and every year, if I actually look at African continent, I think we do not have a country that has a budget surplus. A budget surplus would simply mean you're spending less than you're collecting in your domestic revenue. But the estimates that we have looked at, because mainly African countries are either low-income countries, or they also struggle with human development. So they are categorized as, by UNDP, most of them, about 34 African countries, are categorized as low human development categories. Now, that would mean that you have huge human development challenges. And in terms of demographic, Africa also has a big population. So meaning that you need to actually invest, you need resources to invest in this human development. In terms of infrastructure, Africa still has the largest infrastructure gap. So meaning that on the expenditure side, the expenditure needs are enormous. But in terms of tax effort, Africa actually has the least tax effort. So meaning that on one end, you have huge development needs, on the other end, you have the low tax effort. So what it simply means that if you have to meet these needs, you have to borrow. Are we together? And that's what is causing our debt levels to rise. But then, what we see is that today, in terms of investment needs, the ones that are still costed by UNEC and our partners, is that Africa's additional financing is in excess 500, that's additional financing is in excess of 500 billion. And currently, if you looked at the concept note that was given to you by AFRODAD, the current revenue that we collect is about 457 or so. So meaning that our additional needs over and beyond the revenue are higher than the current revenue that we collect. So the needs are actually big. So then how do you ensure that you meet these needs without creating the risks that we've seen of liquidity so what we see, normally what causes public debt to rise is one, if you have a war, then you have emergency expenditure. See, we've seen like with the destruction in Ukraine, if expenditure is likely to rise. So if Ukraine coming from a war, it doesn't have, the economic potential has been hampered, so the revenue will be small. So in that it's acceptable to actually increase your, what we saw that we've seen, whether it's the 2008 financial crisis or even the COVID crisis. Now what COVID crisis brought is that we had lockdowns in many of our economies, we had economic activity slump. And revenue depends on the economic activity that you have. So meaning that revenue was declining. But at the same point, we had challenges of livelihood, we had challenges of life. So it means that government had to increase because we had near bankruptcy of households and farms. So meaning that when the economy, these two are struggling, then government as a key stakeholder is what will protect the economies from failing. So in that, it is recommended that you can spend, temporarily increase your expenditure in order to rebuild and rebuffer these economies. So those are some of the causes that you can have rising fiscal deficit. What have we seen in terms of the trend for So we've had the history of where debt forgiveness under the highly indebted poor country and the MDRI. What we've seen here, if you look at where the curve is going down, that is where we're having a debt relief. But what we see is that in recent years, we've actually gone back to pre-debt relief levels. You see that the curve is actually fast rising. Now the lower curve, which is in green, is showing the Sub-Saharan Africa. So showing that Sub-Saharan Africa, in the medium term, after 2020, it should have its debt coming down. But then the big question, I think, which we'll be asking even as media, are we likely to see that coming down? Because we've seen all these projections time and again, whereby you should adjust down your debt, but you have huge demand. The likelihood that you will see that green curve coming down is also not likely possible. And I think that's where we need to be very vigilant and keep our eyes on whether debt will actually come down in Sub-Saharan Africa the next 5 years if we are to remain in a debt sustainable path. But one important thing that we should see, and there are many schools of thought in economics that say today's debt is tomorrow's taxation, because taxation is your fundamental basket of paying off this debt. So meaning that if you're not going to pay your mistakes today, if you do not invest prudently, are going to be borne by our children in terms of taxation. So what we see here is that debt, the red curve, has been rising faster than the rate at which revenue is rising. So again, it shows that if we keep this trend, we are not likely to actually debt limit, because debt is rising at a much faster rate than. Now, in terms of debt sustainability, where you see red, and this was actually before pre-COVID, so some of these have been adjusted. But where you see red, those are the ones that are in the debt burden. So the risks of meeting their fiscal needs are actually quite high. Then what we show also on the other side is that these are countries on the right. These are countries that benefited from a debt relief, but they're already having high debt stress levels. And within the concept note, we've highlighted, I think they've highlighted countries that are already in debt stress or likely to be in debt stress. But here they're always looking at what is your likelihood to meet your needs. Are we together? What is the likelihood? So countries that are in debt stress are at the risk of defaulting. You know, today the debate is that Russia will default on its debt because they have been cut off the financial system. They don't have the dollars, but they have managed to meet, even because of the reserves there, they have managed to meet some of their short-term obligations. But in the medium term, you see that the sovereign ratings are now starting to come down on Russia because the likelihood to default is quite high. So even when you're in these countries, and when these risks manifest, because what we saw with the Greece, or even when we had the Euro debt crisis, Greece had also reached high levels of debt burden. So meaning that it had immediate expenditure needs, but it was not collecting enough revenue. But it's coming back to the market, and the market is telling them, you're too indebted, we can't lend to you. The multilateral development partners are saying, if we have to lend to you, we have to lend to you when you have restructured. You're allowing pensioners to go at 50. That means an immediate fiscal need. Then your revenue is not enough. You have ships that are not being taxed. So you need to do all these reforms that you bring in revenue. And then the creditors will be able to look at you again and say you're bankable. And remember, Greece could not print its own money. No longer had that power because it was part of the Eurozone. So it was depending on the euro, which was issued by the European Central Bank. So when these risks manifest, you either go into printing money, but that has significant adverse effects. Your money will lose value, and you will cause, you'll have money. You have 1 million shillings just buying your bread. See? So these are the things that you want to also always. And what has COVID, I had explained a bit on, so it gives us a bit of trilemma in the sense that we had increased the spending, we had reduced revenue, but at the same time, from what we've seen in the previous slide, is that the risks of debt have gone up. So what do we do in such a situation? Now, of course, the debate was that in the short term, you need to survive the war, and then you reconstruct. But then for how long can you do this? I think that's the question that is being asked. So it's this whole dilemma that you need to spend more, but you have less tax effort, but also at the same time, you need to reduce your debt. Now, if you've been following some of the advocates like Jeff Sachs, they've been advocating, saying these are poor economies. You can't ask them to start living within their means. So we should allow them some debt expansion and be able to restructure to ensure that they are able to meet some of their needs. But then the debate is who's willing, and I think Jason touched on it, that some of the private creditors are not willing to come on the table to have that discussion. So again, but we'll look at, and I think in this case, Jason touched on some of the initiatives that, I give you the additional spending. If you look at the additional spending needs, it was above 500. But what we've been able to get as African economies from this debt service suspension scheme is about 10 billion over the 2 years. So it's not sizable, a lot of money. When you spoke about the special drawing rights, it was also not much, the $30 billion. So it is just, again, small amounts it gives you relief. And what this was actually trying to address, if you think about it, it was trying to address liquidity challenge. Because if you were able to pay this money, you are not going to be able, and the conditionality here was that the savings you have here should be invested in health and COVID-related measures. So that was the kind of conditionality around, and maybe to understand better, I think many times I've even had journalists call me in Uganda, they've had to ask what are special drawing rights. So I put a video here, maybe I could ask the one who's presenting to click on the link at the bottom to allow us to view shortly and understand what the special drawing rights are from the IMF. So in terms of special drawing rights, maybe let me touch on it briefly. These are so you're allocated special drawing rights by the IMF based on the shares you have with IMF, but which are computed based on your relative economic power in the world. So Africa's economic power, if you look at Africa as a whole, our contributions, there are two main economic flows, trade and maybe your global output. Africa's contribution to global trade is 2 to 3%. The same thing with Africa's share of economic output or GDP to the global GDP, just 2 to 3%. So in terms of allocation, we are also likely to get the same amount of allocation. Now we are given allocations. These allocations are not tangible currency, but it can be exchanged for the agreed reserve currency. So once you draw down if you want to use the money, you will draw down your allocation. But remember what they do is that if you have an allocation and you draw it down, then you start paying interest to the IMF. So there is an interest that accrues when you utilize the funds. Are we together? So countries that have good foreign exchange reserves can actually buy part of your allocation, and that's how you get resources, the conversion of those resources to use them. But what we are saying that even when we are going to use them, in terms of the absolute amounts that we collect, it is still a small amount of money. And that's why I think the debate is that we should be getting to say that these are poor countries. We wait into the discussion that they should be getting higher, not just using the economic power to allocate this special drawing rights. So what should we look at at country level, what should be the issues that we should look at? One of the things that we should look at is in terms of fiscal policies, the budget, we spend every year. And we should be looking at, there are three things that we should look at. One, how you allocate the money. Okay, basically, if you're going to spend, how are you going to finance the deficit? Because how you finance the deficit relative to your already debt level matters. That's why we say fiscal discipline. The second is in terms of allocative efficiency. Allocative efficiency means that if you're spending, if you're allocating these resources, are they going to where they should be, yielding the best return? Now, when the resources are also allocated, then you look at operational efficiency, how the resources then are utilized. So that's in terms of the prudent fiscal policy, that you should be looking at it from the three dimensions. You should not overly spend beyond your means. You should also not, what we've seen in many other countries is that when you have wide spending, you don't have a lot of foreign borrowing, then you go for domestic borrowing. Now when you go for domestic borrowing, you're competing with the private sector. So when you're competing with the private sector, governments will then, banks now in many developing economies, like in Africa, banks have gone to lending to government as opposed to lending to the private sector. Because the private sector potential is also a bit constrained. The bankable private sector, a lot of it is informal, so banks now choose to go to lending to government. And that means that you're crowding out the private sector, who are the creators of the employment. Who should be the thrust, who are the ones you should be taxing eventually to actually repay the debt. So those are some of the things that we should be looking at. We should understand how our budget is financed. We should understand whether the budget will create debt risk. So that's the prudent fiscal. The other aspect that we do not normally take on, particularly when we are discussing, is in terms of government obligations to the suppliers, whether it's from us or from. Now these are domestic areas. In many of these African economies, you see governments not paying timely their obligations. And this creates a rise in domestic areas. In my country, it's about 3% of GDP. And these numbers are not factored into the debt sustainability framework. But eventually, it's a call on revenue as well. So meaning that we must pay attention on domestic area strategies we have in our economy. The other is in terms of, I keep telling people that governments are borrowers, but they're also lenders. Every time we guarantee, we are in principle saying we have lent. Because if that guarantee does not materialize, then it means that it is us, as it is the government that will take on the liability. Now, for most of the public-private partnerships, so for example, most of the road tolls that I've seen in Africa, the government will take the demand risk liability. To say that if the toll revenues do not materialize into the revenue to meet the availability payments to the private sector, then government would have to pay those top-up payments. And in most instances, we've seen actually where the private sector comes up and says, but this revenue will never materialize. So government eventually buys back the project. So it goes back into traditional. Buying back means that now you get debt and then you buy back the project. So the benefits of a PPP have not necessarily been accrued. And PPPs, this is public-private partnerships. Essentially, you want to build a road, you bring in private sector, who brings in their equity into the project, but equity is more expensive than debt. But because they bring in efficiency, you tend, and also, instead of you borrowing today, the private sector is not asking for that resource immediately. So what you should have borrowed to invest in hard infrastructure is now being made by someone else. So you pay in the longer term. But if the demand risk materializes, then it comes back to government. So we must also pay critical eye to the private, and I think it's important also for the media to say, let's not just look at traditional debt, but what are the other aspects that we should look at. Then the whole aspect of transparency, debt information, how it is published. One particular, for me, initiative that I like is the extractive industry transparency initiatives, whereby companies that are involved in natural resource extraction publish what they pay government, and government publishes what they receive. So at the end, you're able to reconcile. Now, of these factories, I know like when Nigeria first signed up to the extractive industry, the EITI, it was able to save, to identify that what the companies had paid and what government had received. There was a difference of $8 billion. So then there had to be reconciliation, and there was gradual recovery of some of the money. So it's some of these initiatives that, and I think Jason kept touching on it, on these non-disclosure clauses on some of the agreements that we sign. We should advocate for as much information on these agreements because we are key stakeholders of this debt. We also must understand some of these, and I think we can have a call on, the IMF and the World Bank on some of the tools they use and they run programs where they simply run programs where they support government to do these diagnostic studies on debt. But I think what is also key is that as key stakeholders in this process, we can be involved, we can understand some of these tools, and then be able to ask the right questions. Because these tools are only necessary, they're not sufficient. So there are certain things that we can, but it's particularly the political risk. And I think the media is good at analyzing the political risk in this framework. Because the economists will commit that we will reduce debt in order to live. But it's the political environment supportive to actually backstop such. And I've seen in many instances, I've seen deviation from the agreed path. That is, and that's how countries just move from, you start from low debt risk, you go to moderate, you go to high risk, then you go to debt budget. If you try to critically analyze that part, you tend to see political dimension. During election years, you see a lot of supplementary spending without of the financing stream. And these are some of these political risks that you see. So again, I keep saying that debt thresholds are only necessary. If we look at most developed economies, they have higher debt levels. Today, the most indebted countries in the world is US, China, Japan, in that order. They are the largest economies in the world. But what are some of those things that matter? And again, I refer to the fact that the poor are not bankers. So the issue is that, in most of these developed economies, interest rates are low. So meaning that the interest rate cost is actually relatively low. Now we've seen in Africa, like I can even give an example of Uganda. Uganda is now a moderate debt risk, but its interest payments are already as a share of GDP or share of revenue, already in the level of a high debt risk burden economy. 1 in 5 of the Ugandan shipping that is collected goes to paying back debt. In only interest payments, by the way, not paying the principal. So again, it means that it refers to the fact that the debt composition, where it's borrowing from, you're now going for more non-concessional and shorter-term borrowing. We've seen many economies in Africa whereby they call them domestic refinancing. So what they do is that every year you have debt that is due to be paid to the private sector, to be paid to the domestic economy. But because you don't have money, you choose the same amount to repay. So it's kind of a Ponzi game. Are we together? But how can you run it continuously? Because the private sector at some point will price you and say you're too risky. And that's when you struggle with, So these risks can easily materialize despite having this debt threshold and debt sustainability framework in place. But the interest rate structure in most of the developing economies are double digits. So, and also, like I mentioned, we've seen a gradual movement to non-concessional, even when it comes to. But one other important factor that even when we borrow from external markets, there is an exchange rate risk that is likely to materialize. And seen it in 2015, when we had many African currencies depreciate. That's when we saw debt levels significantly rising. A case in point was the area at that point, because they were dependent on commodities like oil revenue. So when the potential oil revenue influenced income, it means that they had huge foreign currency needs, but the foreign currency wasn't coming through. So their currency depreciated rapidly. Because at the external currency, their obligations of debt service rose rapidly. Zambia was the same thing, copper, 2015. It rose from, if actually being downgraded into a debt-burdened economy was around the same time. It was a currency issue. So again, these are important to look into. Another thing is that today's debt is tomorrow's revenue. So if you have a highly informal sector, it's hard to tax. Now what we see is that in most economies, in developed economies, you have debt to the corporate sector that is relatively low. When you come to African economies, when you look at debt to formal sector, then you see numbers jumping extremely to high levels. The other thing is, of course, is that we have many, in Africa, we do not have proper reconciliation of public assets. Now, if we have proper reconciliation of public assets, then we would talk with it will not be a quarrel on your needs, on your fiscal. But when you have a lot of state corporations, without proper reconciliation of even the assets and how they are performing and what returns, then it's a That's why when under the structure adjustment policy that was adopted in the late 1980s, it was for these non-performing privatized. So that's why we had a drive to ensure that when you privatize, then take away the need on a call on the budget. But that also did not necessarily work very well. But it is important to look at your debt to performing assets, because then you identify potential revenue to pay. Then, of course, what is also key is in terms of the institutional debt holders, they are easy to restructure. But I think something I want to also raise that maybe we should be asking ourselves. We've been borrowing, we've had a debt relief, with the debt service suspension, but to what end? Are we going to be hostile? It means that you're willing to already live beyond your means, but the risk is borne by someone else. So there's also risk in the long term, but that someone else may not want to bear the risk. Are we together? It's simply like, if you take insurance, then you can drive your car when you're drunk. You see? So in the event that then you will have insurance to bear the cost. But that cannot be sustainable. At some point, there's going to be evidence that you are drunk and there will be no payment. Are we together? So the other issue that I think we usually talk about is that it's the interest rate vis-a-vis the growth. So when your interest rate is higher than your growth, in the longer term, it is hard for you to pay that rate. So take an example, your monthly, your annual income grows by 5%, but you've been borrowing at 16% or 20%. It becomes hard because your annual income source is your source of paying off debt. So eventually it becomes hard to repay and still meet the other needs. Then one critical factor that is what we see with the debt productivity. $1 borrowed, what is the expected return? Seen in the US where you have $1 borrowed and you have $4 return. You have had cases in Africa where you have $1 borrowed and you're getting only 70% return of the dollar. So again, the productivity is very important, starting to come down. Even for developing economies, the thresholds are even much lower. So again, I think as we look into this, it is important to factor into that. We need to have transparent policies. We must internalize the data and understand it. And I believe in all this, the media has a role to play in terms of understanding the public debt, understanding the risk, being independent actors, and being independent actors in the sense that the media covers all legislative processes. There is no loan, external loan in particular, to go through without being approved by Parliament. In the entire cycle, the media has an oversight role to play and ensure that the right information is coming out, particularly either in playing a challenge function or educating the citizens in terms of what. Then the discussions on debt restructuring for fair negotiations, I think this is also very critical. Fostering collaborations between national, regional, and international media organizations to ensure that a key role can play in some of these negotiations. And of course, fostering transparency is also another issue that I think the media can play. So I think that's what I had for today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
This is what he has said. In a budget, there is the revenue side. So you have your revenues here. Those are taxes, direct and indirect, and non-tax, and all that kind of thing. On a personal basis, imagine this is your salary. Imagine all of you have a salary, imagine. So let's just make it personal. This is your salary. So on this side is expenses. So also government stock of expenses, and you as individuals, you also have your expenses. Now, we are talking about debt today that are equal to the expenses. Then they have a balanced budget. So you earn or you spend as much as you earn. Not a bad thing. You can get to March 31st and you've just finished your last coin on March 31st, which you are given on March 1st. You're okay. Or you can have revenues which are greater than your expenses. So this would be a surplus budget. You earn money, 1 million shillings, let's just say in March, and you get to March 31st and you still have 200,000 left, meaning your budget is in surplus. Governments as well, not in Africa right now, but it's happened in the past. You collect taxes, you reach the end of the financial year and you've not spent everything, so you're in surplus. But if your revenues are less, than your expenses, as an individual, they give you 1 million shillings on March 1st, and by the people who get to March 10th and it's finished, so you've got 20 more days to sort yourself out, you're dealing in a deficit budget. And that's that's where debt comes in. So I just go straight back here. So if your expenses are are more than your revenues, so there's this gap. This gap here, which has to be filled, is where normally the debt comes in. And this is called a deficit budget, where your expenses are more than your revenues. The interesting thing, and something you mentioned there, is it doesn't make sense, does it? You have 1 million shillings as a salary and you're budgeting for 2 million. Like, guys will say, it doesn't make sense. Why do governments do this? Would be an interesting subject, and we touched on it there. And why the challenge then becomes that reducing our debt or doing away with the debt altogether as governments is a bit difficult. So I want you to keep that in mind when we're asking our questions. This is the basis of it, why we go into debt, that our expenses. Imagine if your salary was more than your expenses, why would you be borrowing money? Oh well, you could, but it kind of doesn't make sense. So you're borrowing because you've got a gap here that needs to be covered. We get that? So when you're writing your stories on a government budget, these are the two sides of the story you have to be looking at: the revenue and the expenses, and which side of it the government is is at and what causes the debt.
We are talking about public budgets. But as he says, you could also transpose that to individual budgets. And you do that for purposes of, so in the case of Uganda, we have said our public or republic is Uganda. But all these discussions we are doing is because, at least at face value, and someone intellectually would argue otherwise, but at face value, there is a plan. Even at individual level, you said this year, many of you write New Year's resolutions have not been caught up in that fracas. So thank heavens. You say this year I must do this, I must replace the other car or the other bicycle or the other, but I'll also add this. That's a plan. Then the journey begins into the year. At half year, where am I, and all that discussion. So the plan. Now, in the case of Uganda, and many of you who listen to somebody with a heart, he usually talks about infrastructure, and then he talks about Vision 2040. And our seniors have also said that within the Vision 2040, so don't worry about what is Vision 2040 about it. It is a plan, Uganda's plan for development. You'll also be right to ask when you say development, what you mean, what do you mean? It is honestly welcome. So let's say Uganda's plan between then when we started and that by the year 2040 we shall have achieved so much of this, so much of the other, so much. But within this, because this is a long haul, I mean this one. I don't want people to do any other. Not this one. Or this one. So this one. This was broken down into what is usually a 5-year. At the individual level, I have a 10-year plan, but every 2 years, this is what I put down so that it is appetizing, because it can be achieved in the short term. Some 1, 2, 3 objectives or activities can be achieved, but also that is being borrowed or it is contributing to my longer 10-year plan. So that's the 5-year plan in the case of Uganda, and we chose to baptize it. Whether we chose to baptize it or not is another intellectual discussion, because how come the same Zambia Dr. Enoch is talking about also has a national development plan? I was looking through the Saudi Arabian one when we are developing ours here, and I see similar, even wording. So I am not sure that it is our own necessarily, but let's say it is. And we call it the National Development. Development what?
Plan.
Development plan. In the case of Uganda, we are now implementing the 3rd phase to realizing this. So that's the first basic I also wanted us to begin with, that there is a plan, and you are looking for money. You are looking for not money just, but resources. Resources also include the time. Something must be delivered within a given timeline. Otherwise, the time for this particular crop into the ground has passed. When you do, you reap air. Okay? So the resources like time, like money, like people to execute, and all that. So that's where we are coming from. The purpose is, because somebody may, why are we borrowing? Why are we even paying all these taxes every now and then? Where this revenue that Mr. Charles is talking about is going to come from. So this plan can only be implemented, or ideally should be, by a budget. So a budget basically is like a costed plan. Okay, I need these 5 months, I'll need 7 million. In the other month, I'll need 700 million. It's a costed kind of plan. That's the budget. And that's what he's saying, that it has 2 arms. It has the left and the right. The left is what he has called the revenue. In government literature, it will be called income in some of the cases. So when you meet either this or the other, they are simply the same. Then here is the expenditure. So if this is the right arm for you, because for me it may be the right arm, it may be the left arm, because I'm facing here. For it could be a different one, depending on which one is your left arm. So it has those two sides that Mr. Ushan has talked about. Now, the discussion, the summary of all this discussion is that where will this come from? You need so much, you need so much. Where will it come from? Part of it, let's suppose money for OTT. Then you guys and my guy and the others and plus ourselves. No, there shall be no taxing of OTT. Let's add on fuel, like now on fuel, on we get, I think, 1,500 as tax for every liter of fuel. So don't ask why you are paying 5,000 at the actual pump prices. That's the tax, our own generated money. But there is another component which is called non-tax. So this is tax, revenue or tax, income, then non-tax, revenue or non-tax income. So in government literature you find a lot of this jargon. I know we have a session to deal with the jargons, the NTRs. The other one is those who claim to be more Christian than others, to be more popular, to be more Catholic than the Pope. We say no. You are not. You are good guys. You are this and the other. Can we give you this car? Come on for it, spend. There are those who say spend it wherever. There are those who say spend, but as we are Irish Aid, we are only interested in education in Karamoja and in secondary school education. Some are specific. But as a grant, we look at a grant more in detail, but it basically means that somebody has given you money or has given you resources for that matter, could be very conservative, for you to use in executing your national development plan in the case of that. But then the other one is where the borrowing comes in. So you could say loans, okay? And we also tomorrow look at the details of loans. So these loans are main also what we are talking. It is this that becomes the debt. So the loan could be got from the domestic or internal market or internally within the geographical boundaries of Uganda as defined by the Constitution of 1995 and others before, but also could be external. So that you spend on your plans. And that's what we are talking about, especially here. Where is this money going to come from? And how much? And what is the implication on your intentions? And why are you doing this? You want to improve, at least it is said, improve the economic conditions of Ugandans. Somebody who was working for the stomach now can have an additional income into the pocket and also still provide for the stomach. Somebody whose child wasn't going to school, or rather himself or herself, can now afford to do so. Of course, there is also the social development, the general social development. When you eat better, you are likely to speak better, you are likely to be a better quality of a person. So all those intentions is why you are spending and doing the following. So the discussion, as Mr. Mshari says, is situated within here. But the particular discussion that we even have at hand is here. So I would want that we have that bigger kind of hindsight or mindset that even the discussions we talk about here, just in this item 4, will have an implication on we need more money, we can't continue borrowing. Maybe we increase taxes. So you see, it has a relationship. No, there is a lot of grants. We actually don't need to burden Uganda. So this tax X has been reduced or even removed altogether. So that's the other general introductory that I felt, my heart felt should be.
Thank you. My name is Ramson Hiwe. I work with CTV. I'm wondering whether the African countries are actually deliberately borrowing, even when means of debt, what's the word? Debt facilitation? It's not debt facilitation.
Debt suspension?
No. Paying back the debt. I use the statement. Paying debt servicing. Yeah.
Debt servicing.
Yeah, debt servicing. Because debt servicing seems to be difficult with some African countries. Borrowing still continues even when some have hit the threshold, borrowing still continues. I'm wondering, is it deliberate? And also, these very lenders, can they reach a time and say, okay, enough is enough? At that point, we can no longer give you money. Should they be continuing to say, okay, give them? Or it could be among some of the terms and conditions of borrowing that could be enticing them to give out those loans. You know, people are worried the international airport could be Chinese airport, much as the government continues to say, it is our airport, but there is a concern. There are not so many that you will convince that actually the airport is not taken. Most of Ugandans will tell you the airport is taken. You know, could they be the terms and conditions of this that actually force these lenders continue giving out money instead of saying, look, enough is enough? And then someone, I think the moderator was talking about the East African debt to GDP ratio being 50, and then I heard him say it was 70%. I was wondering.
That was Zimbabwe.
Yeah, Zimbabwe.
Because of Zimbabwe.
70%. I'm wondering what determines that. Why is it Uganda 70%? Thank you.
I wanted to have a good understanding on why this threshold is so important. Because we have seen so many countries, especially developed ones, having a very high debt to GDP ratio. And I'm always asking myself, why should they have a higher, they have the higher threshold compared to the least developing countries. What are the most dominant factors that make those countries to have that higher and perhaps have a lower? Then two is in regard to issue of borrowing. We know borrowing is good, for example in Uganda, but at the same time we realize that these debts are meant to make the people's lives far much better. But at the same time, for the case of Uganda, I see as if it's actually retarding their way of life. For instance, we are now increasing more taxes to collect more revenue. Yet, under normal circumstances, we knew that these laws were supposed to help us improve. So, in this kind of scenario, shall we be rotating in the same circle, in that these laws are not helping us go where we are supposed to go? Thank you.
Yes, good morning. My name is Altwara. When the COVID struck, IMF gave us some money. And I think it's 1 trillion that should be dispersed in tranches. And last 2 weeks, they released the second tranche of the money, about 450 or something billion. And when we had an interview with the IMF rep regarding this money, he said this was interest-free. Now, in my own understanding, I would think there's no free money. When they say interest-free, or it's zero interest on it, and they're giving it to you for a period of time, I believe money you have now is cheaper than money you'll have in the next, I don't know, maybe 5 years. And I just want an explanation on how you view the way they explain issues of debt. When they tell it's zero interest, will Uganda really pay zero interest in the next 10 years on that facility? Thank you.
The first question came that countries are forgiven their debt, but the debt continues to rise. If I remember that question well. So think about it like this, that one time you are given debt, or you are given a loan, you are lent money, you are told, to get the loan, you had said, I'm going to go back to school and do a master's, and then when I get the master's, I will get a bigger salary. That's what in order to get the loan, that's what you say. When you got the loan, you decided to blast, you went to the bars and casinos and whatever, and blew the money. So now, when the loan period starts coming into effect, you don't have additional income to pay off the loan you put it. Because the idea was that if I'm earning 1 million, I'll get my master's, then I'll earn 2 million, then I'll be able to pay maybe 500,000. But now you can imagine, you're still on your 1 million, the loan is come due, now you're going to pay 500,000 anyway, because the other guys don't want to know. They just want to have their money. 500,000. Now you're in trouble because you used to live on 1 million, now you're being forced to live on 500,000. So you're tighter. So the debt forgiveness, they said, okay, fine, okay. You guys, we can see, you or your people made mistakes earlier. We shall forgive your 500,000. Don't pay us the 500,000 so that you can maybe go back to school or something. But what happened with the debt forgiveness, and this happened in the late 90s, and I think it continues to happen. Whenever they say they have forgiven you, they say, okay, fine. The 500,000 you are supposed to have paid us, now go back to school on it. In fact, instead you write a check directly to the school, so this time you don't go the other side. So that's what happens to the debt. That's what happened to the debt forgiveness. But you see, you've also grown. You should have earned your master's 2 years ago. You should have been earning 2 million for 2 years. But you see, maybe children have come into the picture, so your needs are still even higher. So once they've forgiven you your debt, you go back and say, excuse me, but you see, now I have, the other time when I was talking, I was alone. Now I'm married, I have 2 kids, I need more money. So that's how debt increases. That's my basic understanding of the thing. On a national level, you think of it that we forgave you, you took out your debt in 2000, we forgave you in 2005, your population has grown. You can't say like some famous person said, sometime we shall not wait for Karamoja to develop. Because there's also politics. Actually, one of the main things that drives debt is politics. You can't say that, you see, my budget is not balanced, therefore I'm not going to build a road to Karamoja. You can't say, my friend, if you don't want to vote, you keep talking like that. So the reality of that sometimes drives us to debt. But if you think about it, if you spend, maybe it's a subject we shall talk about, but if you spend your debt properly, actually we shall talk about it a bit later, you shall increase your income. And therefore, you can be able to borrow even more. So for example, in 1986, famous figure that is put around is that the tax revenues of Uganda were 500 billion. Now, I think we're projecting about 21, 22 trillion. So economic activity has increased in the time. And a lot of it was driven by debt. So we took the debt and we did good things, like we built roads which increased economic activity. So even if they forgive you debt, there are certain realities that happen to you that mean you still need more. For example, when I went to university many years ago, don't ask me, in our year, we were 2,000 students going to university. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what would happen in Uganda today if you said, okay, only 2,000 are going to university? There would be riots in this place. Now you're about 100,000, I think, I don't know, 100,000 kids go to university. It did not happen by mistake. Some of those universities were built, out of debt. So that's why, to answer your question, sometimes even when you forgive a debt, you go back for more. And if you look at our debt now, compared to what it was in 1986, I've had people famously saying, when Amin left, there was no debt. Now there's debt. Well, you need to go and then ask, why did Amin not have debt? Before you start talking like that. And there were repercussions for that, there not being debt at that time, that are affecting us up to today. But maybe that's a longer discussion. There was another question about why don't they stop the debt? Why don't they just stop giving us this debt? Clearly, okay, we are better off now than we were a while ago, but why can't they just stop? You refer to the Chinese, the airport being called the Chinese airport. Well, unfortunately, a lot of people believe this because it's an easy story to believe. But if you look in the details, and that's why you're a journalist, it's not quite the way it is being portrayed. It's easy for people. When you don't know something, it's easy to send you one direction or another. But the truth is, debt, now this is not really economics, but debt is also used as a means of influence. I give you debt so that you can do what I want. Or I can influence you. That is why I'm never excited when, you know, with all respect to the people, when people jump up and say, we're not going to give you debt, we have cut off our debt to you, what, because you, just say as an example, because you've got a law against anti-homosexuality. The fact of the matter is, when somebody jumps out, somebody jumps in. Because somebody wants influence. So those people who are threatening to jump out, they change their minds along the way. Of course, sometimes there's pain. I mean, in the negotiation process, in the middle there is pain. But one of the reasons debt continues coming is because it's a way of influence. I saw an article the other day that the development banks in China have lent, I think it was easily 5 times more than the European Western economies to develop infrastructure in Africa. And the Europeans, or the Western economies, are concerned not because Africans are getting too much money, they are concerned that China's influence on the continent is growing more than theirs. So that's why sometimes we've had debt that we don't even use well. I mean, there are countries like Congo, they just blew all the debt, they squandered it. I don't know who has been to Congo here. If you go to Congo, you come running back to Uganda because it's just a disaster area. You know, can you imagine doing a trip from here to, from here to Barara, and it takes you 3 weeks? Because along the way, it can rain, the road gets so messed up, you have to live there for a week. Literally live there for a week until the rain, the road hopefully becomes a bit usable. You know, in Uganda you can't imagine those things, but it happens in those places. So sometimes, I'm sure Julius will give you the technical economic thing, debt continues because they need to keep influencing you.
The world profits from Africa by a number of these Africans and international organizations that participated in this work. A summary of it, and borrowing from Enoch, from what Enoch earlier on presented, a summary of it is that for every $162 billion, you could even say for every 162 shillings that comes into Africa, it goes away again with 203. So the 163 as a carrier, 62 comes into Africa as a carrier, and it carries 203. So when it is going away, it goes back with the original 163 plus the 203. So who is working for who? Exactly. So for me, that's where I'm coming from, that none of these who claim Christian enough and Islam enough are more Islam than Muhammad, or are more Christian than the Christian philosophy. But rather that they are here for themselves. That is there. And this will help me to answer 1 or 2 of the questions. For every dollar that comes to Africa, it takes away $4. So they go back home when they are 5. The one came and picked the 5 here, and they went home celebrating Yorkshire and many other places. The question will be, how does that happen? And that will bring me to Uganda. But I could also demonstrate it for Africa. How does this happen? I'll give you an example. And the heading here says, this is about Uganda. It says Uganda's debt predicament, don't worry about the hard one, just to, is as old as before her independence, arguably if you are independent. But assuming you are. In primary, we are told Uganda's independence came on 9 October 1962. This is what you are told. Depending on the school you went to this time. So this time we should have gone to the therefore in primary school they must have told this. That some was some Conot man lowered the flag in Kololo. So whether you are independent or not, that basically discussion. Let us take this book finally. Now we are just taking an example of 2 loans, but they could have been as many. And also this translates elsewhere in Africa, at least for the case of the East African community. 2 examples. In 1955, it is here, in 1955, Uganda had already acquired $24 million loan from the World Bank. You see, the other Christian guys, very Christian, and they go for the communion and need we. This was for purposes of development of the regional railway. I hope you remember there was, those who are holding up and have read, there was East African Harbours and railways. East Africa, Kenya, Uganda was being managed as one block by the Mzungu from Britain. So it was all seen as one block or semi-autonomous block within the entire confederation, like a federation. You had already acquired that. For what? For railways. That is one. By June 1961, you had acquired $8.4 million. Alone, for what? For what they had baptized Owen Falls Dam, the Narubale Dam here in Jinja. So just let us look at those two examples. What was the railway carrying and for who? Many of you have not seen the railway, so I wouldn't be surprised. Me have seen some locomotive engine of 1919 crossing over in this area near National Road. I am told it is a railway. When I type in Google and I see what the railways are, I am not sure that that one is not part of the museum. But just in case it is a railway. What was that railway for? Anyone who remembers, I think that's P5 over P6. P6. What was the railway for? It was cause you development.
No.
What was the railway for? Anyone who remembers what the railway was for? Let's even, maybe as a quick reminder, where was the railway line? We are told the Indian coolies started from Mombasa, not so? You remember the Indian coolies? That's how the Indian so-called investors and business people finally settled here. The initial ones before Amin came in. From Mombasa, you remember man-eaters of Savo? Or why you have forgotten? You guys, maybe we should have started this side. I think Mombasa comes from the other side to Uganda. Man-eaters of Savo here, is that at Nairobi, is that at Naivasha, the notorious Naivasha and Kisumu into Uganda. Where does the railway enter Uganda from? The railway line? Hey, you guys, you are the journalists. You know better than we do.
Yes.
Is it at Marara here in Mukono or is it at Maraba?
Maraba.
Assuming Maraba. Then it comes into Tororo somewhere, then it comes into finally into a certain Kampala. Those days it will continue to a certain Kirende. I am even being specific, I'm not saying it will go to Kasese. I am saying it will go to Kirende. What was in Kirende?
Copper.
Or what is there perhaps? Copper. Copper and copper. But that time the technology could only afford copper. When it would be copper, where would it go? We are not talking about copper rivets of certain minerals somewhere. You remember? In the Congo. In Congo, in the rivets Congo. Where would it come? Now it is in Kasese, here, Kirembe Manya. Where would it go? Where would the copper go? Where would it be taken? No, it would first go to Jinja for smelting. You guys, I hope we went to we studied under the same syllabus.
Masese.
To Masese. It would first go for smelting. Smelting, you definitely needed the power. Therefore, the loan that we are talking about here of expansion of development and expansion of Naruba. Because the previous one, which was there, was small and they required something substantial. Smelt copper, So when copper was picked, what would happen? Where would it go? Where would the copper go? The smelt copper. We are going to check whether your papers are not from Nazareth. The copper would go to, my grandmother would have called it Uingereza, which is Britain. There was a railway line, you remember a railway line that was going up to my beloved Namasagari area here? Namasagari Puramuti area. Those who are Abasogabene. What was this railway line come to do in Namasagari? Was it bringing further grains? What was the railway line going to do in Namasagari? Hey, you guys. You understand that these things were your fingertips. It would go pick cotton. Where would it take the cotton? Marks and Spencer. A product of Yorkshire, Marks and Spencer. The guys don't even cannot recognize a cotton plant. but they are the Marks and Spencer here. So that's what we are talking about. Those who claim to have given you loans for development, I think your own development would come really as a residual, or as a subsidiary, or as an accident, or as a soothing. When the rat is on your feet, I'm told in some parts of Uganda, it features a bit then it soothes. You only wake up in the morning and half the soul is not there, depending on your hygiene. So that's a similar thing, and you don't have to agree with me, but these are things which are written in black and white. The World Bank itself acknowledges these facts. Before independence, because if the World Bank was for independence, why are you still going to the World Bank to borrow? By now you'd have graduated and also become a lender. But you have been designed to be a perpetual raw material for their well-being. So the global discussion, we have shared the global taking Africa as a case, the honest account that for every dollar that comes, it makes more money. So against that background, the question is, you have been debt forgiven. First of all, why have you been debt forgiven? These guys are too Christian, not so. They go on Sunday, so they are supposed to forgive sinners, and I think that is okay. And that they have done. But the same guys, even when you are still limping, have given you more money and you are going back to where you were yesterday. Do you think that they have worse economists and worse politicians and worse social development and worse journalists than you? Not necessarily. Who are just asking they are here for their survival because they know the bottom line is that for every dollar that comes into Africa, it walks away with even more. So yes, we can give you the money, we can even decide to forgive you allegedly. Because after all, we have already faced much more in debt servicing and all this. Okay? I think for me that was the bit of the background I wanted to start with. And you don't have to agree with me. Don't say when we are African we are discriminated like some people always complain about the certain Kwanzi. It begins with the KY, but I know that some ends with Kwanzi. Debt and this debt council. Debt and as the Bushar is highlighted earlier on. It is even a British saying, he who pays the piper, what happens? Calls the tune. So that's why Bushar is saying, we have been forced for certain reasons to spend in certain areas. What is your return on investment that you are talking about? So that's the economics part of it. The other one is the politics part of it. This was the money issue. The other one is the politics part of it, which will also bring me to Uganda level. The politics part of it, there are those who claim social justice, like myself, and we say, we shall not leave Karamoja behind. You are the ones who go singing every day. Leave no one behind. Sustainable development goals, and they have crowned all of them, which is okay. So against that background, even when World Bank says no, don't invest in covered with sorrow, don't invest in Guru, this Guru, Moya, Ochikoma, that road that eventually gets you to near Papa. Don't invest in it. It has no investment of the time. You say, for balancing politics, for balancing this and the other, for spreading what have been seen to be spreading equitable development, that road shall be whether there is or there is not. Beyond the economics in other words. You say this, I think, good either for social development or to be seen that I am a nationalist if you are trying to build the globe. So some of the cases, it is driven by politics. The other cases, it is driven by the economics, but not all the time. So what drives you, as some company says, what will drive you that afternoon that he has to come? So because of this, then the 50%, even when it was seen as the cut-off point, threshold means cut-off point. You go beyond this, you are dead. You go to Nigeria, you are dead. That's what the threshold basically means. You go beyond this, you are entering the danger zone. So Uganda with this said there was no more danger zone in expanding. In the case of Zimbabwe, they have their reasons. In the case of East Africa, it was agreed because of the East African community. Remember, we are trying to forge or build an East African community. Amongst many other things, it means that we should do things in a common way, eventually having a common stance or common position on things, a common position on the economics, and we count things the same way. If you see one in Rwanda, you should see the same one in Sudan, in the Republic of South Sudan. Because of that, our leaders, in the wisdom of our leaders, led by technocrats obviously, agreed that the East African community threshold shall be 50%. And that's why it is coming from. So the Zimbabwe one mainly follows the SADC old leaders wish. But the other one on why not Uganda? So why the threshold is important? The threshold is just an indication. When you are driving and the car goes to 120, but nowadays there are no more bells. There were bells those days. They come here with that 110, saying danger. Others will even start flashing a coffin. I don't know what that coffin means, because not everybody who dies is taken in the coffin. But it would show. So when you are driving and the thing goes to 140, in your head you could be, I think there is danger here. Maybe let me reduce the speed. So it is just an indication. Something to help you say, oh, check, are you still okay? As the Paul says, are you still okay? Check if things are okay. So it was basically that threshold. But that threshold was also set by the International Monetary Fund. You Africans have refused to have yours. You want to keep being fed by others. For their reasons, which we have shown. For every dollar, how much it goes with, for them is the bottom line. So that's why they have said, beyond 50%, we may not risk our money here. So that is how it comes about. It is the IMF that set it, and you Africans, you set your own for your own reasons. That's how we have it, and that's how it comes about. They look at, especially your ability to pay back. If you are expected to service this bank loan every month with 500 shillings, is that money still coming in? When we look ahead, your contract is coming to an end. Will you still be able to bring that money in? That's where it comes in from. Borrowing is good, absolutely, for as long as it can generate money. And I'll give you again a quick example. I just picked a quick example for Japan. Japan is one of the highest indebted countries in the world. This is Wikipedia. I just typed it in when we were here. It is here. As of 2022, let's assume January 1st, New Year's, the Japanese public debt was estimated to be about this trillion. So as Uganda, where we are at about 91 trillion shillings, yet these guys are in $1 trillion, you could theoretically say they are worse off. And perhaps you could divide that extent. The difference, nonetheless, is that for them, the ability to pay, even when this debt at face value appears to have eaten into their GDP, their ability to pay, their ability of honesty, their ability of prudence in managing public resources, that you give me this money to deploy here, I will swear it will not be diverted. It will continue to generate wealth for the country. It's part of what makes the difference here. So you may have a country like US, you may have a country like Japan, like Germany, which appear to have, even by volume alone, huge levels of debt, but also as a percentage of GDP, huge, beyond up to about 90%. But their ability for the economies to keep servicing that loan, without defaulting, is for you what creates a difference. That yours was even set at a much higher level because of, you and I who we are. You just need to stand at the electoral commission and see who we are. The way we drive, the child is crossing to school, we are hooting because the child, we are also carrying children whom we are taking to school against this one who is crossing the road. So for you, a threshold is at 50 because we know your heads are a bit calm. For the others, we can say they are a bit more prudent. They can even go to 90%. So what happens when you default? What happens when you default, I don't know. But what happens if you have a bank loan at Baroda and you default, with the Central Credit Reference Bureau now, you are not going to come to the other bank to do borrowing. Then, this guy is, watch carefully. This guy is a rapist. Don't sit nearby. There were such cases in school. Oh, this guy is a witch. Eh? When he wakes up at midnight, allegedly to go and pray, he's actually on other things in Namiriago and other places. Eh? So that is a bit of how that comes in. There is a question of Mr. Twa, which I think I should end with. The 1 trillion shillings, the $1 trillion from the IMF, shall we actually pay at zero? I think that answer, I think I have answered that question. The answer is here. The answer is here. Even when interest, beyond this, even when interest is zero, there will be an allegation of management fees. You know, we have to, you are coming for 2 million shillings at this bank, but you know, we have to paper manage, so that will be 2% of the loan. So while you applied for a loan of 2 million shillings, the actual that may come to you is perhaps less. Why? You see, we have to, whenever somebody clicks at to check on your status, has to be paid. When somebody has a paper management, you see legal fees, you see these banks of yours, the ones you call banks here in Uganda. So a similar thing happens. So at first value, zero interest. But at actual value, even of the particular docket of the loan, that particular one, there are management fees and commitment fees and many other fees that come around that you already have to part with, whether you want or you don't. Whether you want or you want. Maybe that's how I should have put it. As in, you must. That is one. Number two, because we have given you this volume of money, we can determine where you should. We can determine who should be your investor in a certain docket. We can determine whether Umeme should continue to run your power entities. We can determine what are the terms of Finlay in the case of tea production in Uganda and processing. We can determine, say, wait, don't do this the way you tell your elder child. Don't do this. Yes, daddy. At times they're going to ask what. Yes, daddy. Yes, daddy. So as long as you are in control on the other side, then you can afford to. So that is the second one. That is the first one.